So Father's Day is a fun day for me. I've got three kids, for those maybe who are newer. I've got three kids, Brooklyn, who is 9, Mason is 8, and Gavin is 4. Almost 5, he'll be sure to let you know that. They're awesome kids. They are an absolute handful. A couple weeks ago, we were in a little parenting series, and I talked about the curse that sometimes parents put on their kids. You know, one day I hope you have children that act exactly the way that you act. My mom did that to me a lot, and it took. And so my kids all have, they're a handful. But they keep me on my toes. They are so much fun. They are kind, and they think about other people, and they love people. They're amazing kids. I'm so fortunate. And then I am also, Father's Day is also fun for me because I had a really good dad. I was very lucky in that regard. My dad was an incredible guy. He was far from perfect. I was not. My family did a really good job growing up of they didn't hide sometimes the messes that can happen in life. And so I knew that my dad wasn't perfect, but my dad was the best image of Jesus of anybody that I've known in my life. So Father's Day is very fun for me in a lot of ways, but Father's Day is also very complicated for me in a lot of ways. Because as you likely picked up on just a moment ago, I'm speaking of my dad in the past tense. My dad died 19 months ago this past Friday, so just a little bit over 19 months ago. He was 65. He had never really been sick in his life until he turned 60, and he developed a rare condition that put him into heart failure. And we were very fortunate that we got another 5 years with him, but that was it. And Dad passed away in November of 21, and I wasn't going to get emotional, but Dad passed away in November of 21, and I miss him like a lot. My dad was a part of our church, and before we put the little production booth in the back there in the middle, Dad would typically stand in the back against the back wall, and when I'd tell stories about all the dumb stuff I did or the dumb stuff my kids did, he would just start laughing, and my dad had this huge booming laugh that would fill a room, and if he really got to cranking away, he'd start smacking his knee and crying. And then snorting is great, is the best. I miss the way that he would ooh at nice cars when they would drive by. I miss the way that he would very viscerally, like from his gut, moan when he ate food that he especially enjoyed. And then that he would lick his fingers very approvingly when he was done. There was no wiping them on napkins, like he was going to get all the juice, you know? I miss my dad. And so Father's Day is a complicated day for me too, because I would do just about anything to be able to give my dad a hug today and tell him I love him. And I know that for a lot of us, Father's Day is complicated like that. For a lot of us, Father's Day is complicated because maybe we miss a father. Maybe you're in the same boat I'm in. Maybe you've lost a parent. And it's a very weird thing. My mom and I were talking this morning just for a minute. She walked away pretty quickly. I think it's because she didn't want to get to crying herself. But my mom and I were just talking this morning about, it's been 19 months and it still doesn't feel real. And she looked at me and she said, "Do you think it ever will?" I said, "Probably not." It's just a weird thing. There's just a hole there. He's buried right around the corner from our house, and every now and then we'll go through the cemetery, and Mom made an executive decision on her own that I'm not sure I approve of, by the way. On the back of Dad's headstone, she put parents of Andrew and Elizabeth Schultz. So I see my name on a gravestone, and I'm just not, she didn't consult me on that choice. It's a very weird thing. Let me just go ahead and tell you that. But we'll go through the cemetery, and I'll stop and talk to Dad for a minute, and it just doesn't feel real. And I know that a lot of people that I've talked to who have lost a parent have expressed the same kind of thing. It just never quite feels real. So maybe for you today, Father's Day is a little complicated because you miss a father. Maybe today for you, Father's Day is a little complicated because you would like to be a father, but you just haven't been able to become one yet for whatever reason. Maybe today, Father's Day is complicated to you for what I think is probably the most challenging reason, which is that for a lot of people, we didn't have a good dad. Our dad was I was lucky, I was fortunate, God blessed me tremendously. But for a lot of people, they don't grow up in a home with a good dad. And so when we talk about Father's Day, even when you hear the word father, there's stuff that wells up inside. And maybe today's challenging for you in that regard. Each year, when we, as a church, when we have Mother's Day services and Father's Day services, we like to take a moment and just bring out the fact that we know that this isn't just a rah-rah day for everybody. There's a lot of pain. And there can be a lot of heartache for a lot of different reasons. So I want to acknowledge that. But the reason why a moment ago I said that I think that, if you happen to not have a good father, the reason why I said I think that could be the most challenging problem is because the Bible's full of images of God as Father. I find myself often when I pray, in fact, this morning, just a moment ago when I was praying to finish up the set, I almost started with Father because it's very second nature for me. Because I had a good dad who modeled Jesus well for me. And so for me to think of God as Father is easy. It is so, so easy. But for those who didn't have a good dad, or maybe worse, who had a dad that was a bad person, who did bad things, that image of God as Father can be really, really problematic. Because as soon as you hear the word Father, you immediately get an image in your mind. You immediately have a gut reaction. And it doesn't matter that it's about a different father. The word itself can cause problems. And so every year we try to address that. I know that this can be a challenging day. And Father's Day in particular is a tough one because as a guy standing up here talking about God the Father, if you had a bad dad, that can really mess with you. So today what I want to do is I want to take a look at the God that I know. And if you've been around for a couple of Father's Days, you've heard similar messages because it's just what I feel like we need to talk about on Father's Day. I want to try to give you an image of the God that I know, the God that my dad modeled so well for me. We're going to do that through a story that's a little bit interesting on Father's Day of a couple of guys named Cain and Abel. The story of Cain and Abel we find in Genesis chapter 4. Now, Genesis is the first book in the Bible. Chapter 4 would be the fourth chapter in the book. So this is very, very early on in the biblical narrative. And as we get to Cain and Abel, we've only gotten through like one part of one family. Genesis 1, 2, and 3 are all about the creation and about God creating Adam and Eve. And then Genesis 4, we get to their sons, Cain and Abel. So this is super, super early on. Now, it's important to understand that the Bible is one book that tells one story. Yes, there's a lot of books inside it. Yes, there's a lot of stories inside of it. But it's one book that tells one story. And what that means is that the stories that are early on are setting up so much that is to come. They're setting up who God is, who people are, how we understand the characters that are at play in this story. I really like to play video games, and some of you might judge me for that. That's okay, I'll take it. But I really like story-driven video games a lot, and there's one that came out years and years and years ago that's now been made into a TV show called The Last of Us. And it is a game that is widely regarded as probably one of the best games that's ever been made because the storyline is just so incredible. And in the opening scene of the video game, which, by the way, I don't remember a lot of things, so to remember any specific scene from any specific thing is kind of a big deal. But the opening scene of the game, there's this girl who's walking around this empty house. And what you come to find is it's a little bit of a sci-fi end of the world kind of a game. What you come to find is that this little girl, Ellie, has lost her entire family. And it's a really emotional, moving opening scene to a video game. And it totally sets up the rest of the game. Like you're hooked like that. Because you just want to know what in the world is going to happen to this kid who's by themselves. The beginning of the Bible is a little bit like that. Like it's setting up everything that is to come. It's showing who the characters are, what the different roles are, and how they interact with each other. And so as we get to Genesis 4 and Cain and Abel, we see an image of God that has actually already been given one time. And it's a powerful, powerful image that is given then throughout the rest of the Old Testament, into the New Testament, and throughout the whole of the Bible. Genesis chapter 4, Cain and Abel, they're brothers. Cain is a farmer, and Abel is a shepherd. And what happens right before where we're about to jump in is they have both brought gifts to God. And the Bible doesn't give a reason why this is the case, but what it says is that God favored Abel's gift. I don't know why. He just did. God looked with favor upon Abel's gift. It doesn't say that he was displeased or angry with Cain. It just says God looked with favor on Abel's gift, but upon Cain, he did not look with favor. So for whatever reason, God looked at Abel's gift and said, that's a good one. And Abel's, he kind of went, ah. And people have speculated why. We don't know. But something happens. Cain gets angry. He feels this is unfair. And if I'm being really honest, on Father's Day, I understand that. Again, I'm so thankful that I'm a dad and I have 3 amazing kids. I'm thankful for the dad that I had. But the thing that is so complicating to me about Father's Day is that it feels unfair. Like, I've had to wrestle even this morning with some anger with God. None of you have ever been angry with God, have you? Just me, just the pastor. I want you to know that that's okay. Like, it's okay to at times be angry with God. Now, that's a whole different sermon for a whole different day. But it's okay to feel angry with God at times. And God and I, we wrestle about that sometimes, especially on a day like Father's Day, because my dad gave his entire life to Jesus. My dad served the Lord for his entire life. He never rebelled against God. He did the right things. He lived the right way. He gave his life to serve God and serve the church. He modeled well for my sister and I what it looked like to be a godly man, a godly husband, a godly father. And then God took him at 65. I had to explain to my, at the time, first and second graders how they were never going to see their pop again. We had the funeral here, and his casket was right over here. And Brooklyn, my oldest, she can be a bit of a basket case at times emotionally. And I'm not joking. We brought the casket out, and we had a little step stool for them so they could get up and see Dad. And the viewing was getting ready to start. We had it on a Sunday evening, and let's say it was at 6 o'clock. I don't remember what time it was, but at 5:59, Brooklyn was basically inside the casket with my dad, wailing. And we're like, what do we do? What do we do with this? We're going to have to pry her off of my dad. And there's people starting to line up. I mean, I had to explain to them how they were never going to see their pop again. And I get angry sometimes when I think about that. I get angry when I think about the fact that Gavin, my youngest, won't really remember my dad very much. We asked him actually the other day, Brooklyn asked him, she said, Gavin, do you remember Pop? And Gavin said, yep. And Brooklyn said, what do you remember about Pop? And Gavin said, he had a big nose. Well, Gavin, you're not wrong, buddy. I get angry, and I wrestle with God about that because it hurts. Abel gave an offering, and Cain got angry. Cain thought it was unfair that God accepted and favored Abel's offering. So we're going to pick up in Genesis chapter 4, starting in verse 8, and see what happens. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out into the field. While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel, and he killed him. So here we are, Genesis 4, people are killing each other. That's how long it takes. When people say, humans are good. Nope. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? And naturally, Cain lies. I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Now, at this point in the biblical narrative, again, we're 4 chapters deep. It's not a lot. This almost directly mirrors what happens in Genesis chapter 3 between Cain and Abel's parents, Adam and Eve, where Eve does a thing she shouldn't do. God confronts her about it, and she blames. Again, the human condition. I don't know, he replied, am I my brother's keeper? The Lord says, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. And now God hands down some consequences to Cain. God says, now you are under a curse and you're driven from the ground, which remember, Cain is a farmer by trade. You're driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. Now, that might feel a little harsh, but I want you to keep in mind as we go through this narrative that the important thing that happened here is not just that Cain killed his brother. That's a big deal. That's a bad thing. But Abel wasn't just Cain's brother. Abel was a child of God. Abel was created in the image of God. Abel was God's precious creation. Cain didn't just kill his brother. Cain killed God's child. And so as God hands down consequences here, this isn't just God standing back and like unemotionally arbitrating a situation like a judge might. This is Cain killing God's son. So God hands down this consequence. He says, hey, you were a farmer. The ground isn't going to work for you anymore. Cain replies, he says, my punishment is more than I can bear. Today you're driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth. And then Cain adds something interesting. He says, and whoever finds me will kill me. It's the first moment that we see fear in Cain. Cain recognizes at this point that his security and his safety is tied to being with his family. And keep in mind, this is like 3,500, 4,000 years ago. Like there was a lot of hostility among tribes. There was a lot of hostility among neighboring people groups. And if Cain wandered out into the land, and as we find later, he ends up settling in a city, they could have just killed him. Cain's afraid. But the Lord said to Cain, notice this response. God says to him, not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. And then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So let's pause for a moment. Cain does, I would think, a thing that is worse than anything you or I have done. Cain kills his brother. Just cold-blooded murder. I am angry that God favored your gift, and I'm going to take care of that. Not just his brother, this is God's child. Now, we like to talk about how God is just. We like to talk about how God's justice can be trusted, and that's true. But this isn't actually just. What would have been just is for God to have taken Cain's life. That would have been an equal punishment. That would have been fair. Right? As people, we're very motivated by things being fair, aren't we? We like to feel like, well, that person got what they deserved. Now, maybe you're a super kind-hearted person, but even the most kind-hearted person, you have a bit of that in you too. Right? Like, when you hear about someone who does truly evil things and that there are consequences, there's a part of all of us that's like, they deserve that. I'm glad that person is in jail. I'm glad that thing. We like fairness. God here could have been fair to Cain. He could have been just to Cain. He could have done the thing that Cain did, and all of a sudden, things are level, things are even. But that's not what God does. See, God doesn't do the just thing. God does the compassionate thing. God doesn't do the fair thing. God does the merciful thing. And in this, we see this is actually the second moment already by Genesis 4 where this has happened. See, in Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve mess up, God hands out consequences. God isn't afraid to hand out consequences, but God doesn't give Adam and Eve what they deserve. And even more so, the nuance here is that God doesn't just say, no, nobody's going to kill you. God puts a mark on Cain to protect him. In Genesis 3, as God sends Adam and Eve out of the garden that he's created for them, he makes them clothing to cover their shame. Because that's just what God does. God doesn't always, in fact, I had written in my notes that God is just, and then I'm reading this story and I'm like, yeah, but he doesn't actually always do the just thing. Sometimes he does the compassionate thing instead of the just thing, and that's even better. Does that make sense? The God that I know is a God who is compassionate and merciful. Who, yes, is just, but who often, maybe usually, treats his children with compassion and with mercy and with grace and with kindness when we don't deserve it at all. Now, for a lot of us who have an image of God the Father, and maybe we have an issue with that father imagery, for a lot of us who have that issue, it's because we had a dad who was the opposite, who did things we did not deserve, that were bad, who treated us in ways that we don't talk about, who did things to us that are unspeakable when we didn't deserve any of it. It's like the complete antithesis. The fathers that some of us have had, I don't just want you to get an image that God is different than them. I want you to get an image that God is the opposite of them. God, when we as his kids do bad things and deserve justice, God doesn't always give us justice. Often God gives us compassion and mercy. Does that mean that God doesn't hand out consequences? No, it doesn't mean that. Because like any good father, they recognize that sometimes the kids need consequences, because kids without consequences, you've met some of those kids. Some of you don't have kids because you've met some of those kids. Some of you stopped having kids because you met some of those kids. You know, like we've met those kids, and we don't like those kids, and we don't want those kids to be friends with our kids. But rather, God, instead of always acting out of justice, God often acts with compassion and with mercy, even when we do the wrong things. That's something that I think my dad did really well. My dad was not afraid to hand out consequences. Some of them, man, any of you ever take the door off your kids' rooms? That's a good one, by the way. I got that more times than I'd care to admit. Dad would tell me, if I was, storming upstairs angry, because some of us, like, our default emotion is sadness, Some of us, our default emotion is anger. If I was storming up the stairs, Dad would holler at me, "You slam that door, it's coming off." So me being a natural line pusher, slammed the door. Guess what had happened a couple minutes later? Dad would very calmly come up the stairs with a screwdriver. And there goes the door. I could holler about it all I want. It didn't make any difference. Now, my door was not a long way away from my parents' room. If I was in my room and my door was right here, I could do this. And I was in my parents' bedroom. So, buddy, that was a severe punishment. My dad wasn't afraid to hand out consequences, but my dad would try to talk to me. He would try to understand. He would try to meet me where I was as much as he could. And when I was an emotional teenage boy who couldn't explain much other than grunting a little bit here and there, he would try to listen, and he would try to understand. And he would try to be compassionate until, well, the compassion ended at a certain point, but the story of Cain and Abel is a story that on the surface looks like it's about, like, don't kill people. But that's not really what it's about. The story of Cain and Abel is really about a God who meets us where we are, who loves us where we are, who, when we do bad things as kids, who, yes, will hand out consequences, but who also will hand out lavish compassion and mercy well beyond what we deserve, because that's who he is. And so if I could summarize the story of Cain and Abel and hopefully adjust the image some of us had in our minds, what I would say is that the story of Cain and Abel shows us that God is a good father, even when we aren't good kids. God is a good father, even when we are not good kids. Now, last year, my kind of key takeaway was God is a good father, even when ours wasn't. There's a theme here. God is a good father, even when we aren't very good kids. For some of us, the stuff that maybe happened to us growing up, the stuff that we've been through, the stuff that we've experienced with our dad, and maybe our dad didn't do like terrible things. Maybe they were just kind of absent. Maybe they're just not maybe they were like a hard guy. My dad, I remember him growing up. He told me a couple different times. He didn't ever make a big deal about this, but he told me a couple of different times throughout my life that my grampy, his dad had never heard Grampy tell him he loved him in his whole life. Now, as was the case with many men who grew up in the 20s and 30s, Grampy was a hard man. He had to be. He was the son of German immigrants. That was not a great time for people with German descent. Grampy fought in World War II. He was a boiler man at Iwo Jima. That was a life I can't imagine. I think in a lot of ways he had to become a hard man to survive. But because of that, my dad never heard his dad say, "I love you." So my dad didn't make that mistake. My dad told me he loved me all the time. Almost every time we saw each other, he'd give me a hug. And he toward the end of his life, I remember talking about this a few different times, and he would be like, "I don't think I did it that much." Yeah, he did. Because it was second nature for him. But as a son, It meant everything to me. My dad would hug me, and he called me A. He'd hug me, and he'd just say, I love you, A. It meant the world. Every kid wants a dad like that, right? That's the God I know. Is a God who wraps his arms around you, and when you're at your lowest, and when you're struggling, and when you're down, and when you've been yelling at your mom, and will talk to you and hand down some consequences, but he'll end it with, I love you, A. Brooklyn got the worst possible characteristic of me that she could have. I love to poke the bear, man. Just love it so much. And if I know I can agitate and rile something up, my mouth just has a hard time not opening, And my mom's easily agitated. And so, man, as a teenager, I would just poke and poke and poke and poke and poke. I've learned that that's not good, so I don't anymore. Poke and poke and poke and poke. Brooklyn got every bit of that from me, every tiny bit. And she can be a lot. We've had some interesting days with her in the last few months. And there have been a couple that have been especially bad, and there have been several days where I've grabbed her and I've hugged her and I've held her tight, and I've just whispered in her ear, Brooklyn, there's nothing you could ever do to make me love you less. There's nothing you could ever do to make me love you less. Now, lest you think I'm a perfect father, that probably came shortly after yelling at her to the point that I was afraid the neighbors might hear. So, I am not a perfect dad. Okay. But I held her because at the end of the day, I needed her to know that I was there. I wasn't going to go anywhere. And that even on our worst days, she's my girl. No matter what. That is the God that I know. That is the God that I see in the story of Cain and Abel, who even when, as his kids, we do terrible things to one another, rather than giving us what is just, he gives us compassion. He gives us mercy. Often, he gives us consequences because we need it. But a God who wraps his arms around us and tells us how much he loves us. Now, that opens up one further question to me as I read the story. As I read the story, I look at it and I go, okay, so what could Cain have done differently? What can we learn from the choices Cain made that led him down this road? And how can we then do those things in our own lives? In other words, if God would give Cain this kind of grace after he murdered his brother, how much more grace might God give us, who hopefully aren't going around killing our siblings? So we're going to take a look back at Genesis chapter 4, but before what we read just a moment ago. What immediately leads into it. This is Genesis chapter 4, starting in verse, kind of the second half of verse 4. It says, the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offerings. That's what I talked about earlier. God looked at Abel's offering with favor. But on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. This makes sense. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? And then verse 7, and this is kind of the kicker. God says, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? So a lot of scholars have debated what this means. The working theory is that there was something underneath the hood in Cain's heart that was not right. In other words, maybe Cain was bringing his offering out of obligation, not out of joy. Maybe Cain was just doing I got to take this stupid thing to God. Where Abel was pleased and was thankful to be able to give his. You see what I'm saying? Most scholars think there was maybe something under the hood, some kind of a heart issue with Cain that wasn't there with Abel. Regardless, it doesn't make any difference. God says, look, just if you do what's right, aren't you going to be accepted? And then God says, but if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Immediately following is what we read a moment ago. Cain takes his brother to the field and he kills him. God in this moment, as he's speaking to Cain, understands because he created us, he wired us, he knows the way that humans work. God knew that Cain had a decision to make. God knew that the anger and the bitterness and the rage and the hatred that was starting to grow in Cain's heart was like an animal, that if he didn't put it in its cage, it would consume him. In fact, there's I don't even know what to call them. There's an organization called the Bible Project. I've talked about them before. If you're not familiar with the Bible Project, they're some of my very favorite biblical scholars. They're incredible. They've got a website with tons of resources about how to read the Bible. And I listen. They have a weekly podcast that's a pretty deep dive into some stuff, and I listen to it regularly. And they had an episode. They did a whole series on they called it The Firstborn, on power dynamics through the Bible. It was fascinating. And they actually brought this story up in that. And there was a quote in there that I think really brings some power to this. God's response to Cain is essentially, you are assuming that there's no exaltation for you too, just because I went to Abel first. So now you've got a choice, whether you will do good or not do good based on this moment. And be careful, because there's an animal at the door. Moral failure is like an animal. It wants you, but just like I called your parents to rule over the animals and they didn't, they let an animal rule them, you have a chance to rule this inner animal. So what are you going to do? That's such a powerful image to me. Because in this moment, God sees what could come, and he warns Cain. He says, this is the road you're on, buddy. You don't see it, but if you go down that road, if you let that animal win, there's no coming back from what you're about to do. But you can make a different choice. And every bit of this comes back to that, well, that's not fair. That's not fair. Why did God, I don't know why God looked on favor with Abel's offering and not Cain's. And so at that point, I have a question to answer. Do I trust that God sees what I can't? Do I trust that if God responds in a certain way that doesn't make sense to me, there's a reason for that? And critically, that it's a good reason, that it's the right reason? Or do I look at what has happened and do I say, that's not fair, that's not okay, and I understand better than you? So I'm going to hold on to that bitterness, I'm going to hold on to that anger, I'm going to hold on to that, I'm going to hold on to those things because I deserve that. I didn't deserve that, so I'm going to do because I deserve this now. Or do I trust that if God responds in a way that doesn't make sense to me, there's a good reason? In this case, I don't know what God saw in Cain. I have no idea. But God saw something in Cain, and I can't help but ask the question kind of to myself, what might have happened if Cain would have listened to God in this moment? What might have happened with Cain's life if he would have said, you know, God, I trust you, and I feel like I deserve to be angry over that thing. I am angry over that thing, God, because it wasn't fair. But maybe it wasn't fair because you see something that I don't. Maybe it wasn't fair because you have perspective that I don't have. Maybe it wasn't fair because there's something inside me that I need to see that right now is a blind spot. What might have been different if Cain would have humbled himself before God and trusted him? I don't know. We could speculate about that forever. But at the end of the day, what happened with Cain was God said, you have a choice to make. And Cain made a choice. And he made the wrong choice, and it cost him dearly. And that choice that Cain had was the same choice you and I have thousands, hundreds of thousands of times throughout our life when we're faced with unfairness. Do I trust God in the unfairness? Do I trust that God is working, that he is moving, that he is doing things that I can't see in the things that are unfair. So what did Cain get wrong? What is the thing that we can learn? Well, it's the thing that had Cain done it differently, it would have made all the difference for him. Like for us, when we're faced with that choice, ultimately what we need to do is we need to do what's right when what God does seems unfair. If Cain does that, this whole story is different. The whole story is different. And not just Cain, but oh my goodness, I mean, story after story after story after story after story after story in the Bible. See, the best thing to me about the Bible is it's just like a case study on my life. The motivations, the inner workings of it's just a story about the human heart as it relates to God. And as humans, we don't like it when things aren't fair. We don't like it when that thing that happened wasn't fair to us. We get angry. We get upset. But the question is the same for Cain then as it is for us today. When God does things, or when God allows things that don't seem fair, do I trust him? Do I trust that he's up to something? Do I trust that he's doing something? Do I really, in the depth of who I am, believe that he is good? When Dad died, I had that choice to make, as I've had many times in my life. Some of the lies that Satan tried to whisper in my head at that time were, if God really loved me, he wouldn't have made the first funeral as a part of the church that I planted be my dad's funeral. That was something I had to really wrestle with. I had to really wrestle with the fact that my dad had given his life to Jesus. I have given my entire life, the best that I know, to Jesus, and gotten through some hard things. And then right after we did one of the most difficult things we've ever done, and we started a church out of nothing, it was just a few months after that Dad got sick and went into heart failure. And at the time, I remember thinking, my dad won't see my kids graduate from high school. And I had to grieve that. But to be honest, I didn't expect that it was only going to be 5 years. Then I had to grieve that. I have to constantly grieve the reality that my youngest son will barely remember my dad. I have to grieve the reality that after Dad got sick, my dad was a very healthy, very involved grandparent. He was the type, when Mason and Brooklyn were little, if he was around them, he wasn't on the couch. Like he was on the floor with them. That was my dad. He was never on the couch when my kids were around. He was wrestling with them and playing with them and reading to them and tickling them and laughing with them. Like he was so involved. And by the end, my dad could barely get on and off the floor. He was just so weak. He could hold one of them on his lap and read, and that was it. And I still grieve that. And I had a choice to make, and I have a choice to make over and over. Do I trust that in all those things that are unfair, that God is doing something good out of them? That choice, I'm going to flip to dads for a moment, men for a moment. That choice requires something that's very difficult for us. It requires a choice of humility. Dads, guys, we might say we are humble people. Like, well, hopefully you're not announcing that to the world because that's probably indicative of something else. But maybe behind closed doors we might say, like, I try really hard to be humble. But as guys, like, we don't like asking for help. We don't actually like humbling ourselves, do we? Like admitting we're not okay, saying I need help. We don't like to show weakness. We like to provide. We like to know that, like, I can provide. I can care for people. I can fix this thing. I can handle the problem. What we don't like is to say, it's not me at all. What we don't like is to say, if it weren't for the power of Christ and the Holy Spirit in my life, I am nothing. We don't like to admit that we aren't capable. But that's exactly what is required to make that choice. One of the most important things, dads, one of the most important things, maybe the most important things that you can teach and model for your children is a humble heart before God. A truly humble heart before God. A heart that says, whatever God asks of me, I'll do it. Whatever it costs me, I'll do it. Wherever he leads me, I will follow. Whatever paycheck, whatever career advancement, whatever stuff that this world says matters, he asks for, I will give it to him. And I won't do it begrudgingly. I won't do it because I must. I'll do it because he is the only one who gave his life for me. If I had to boil down the thing that I think my dad did the best, it was that. My dad modeled for me what it looked like to live humbly submitted to Jesus. And so when I think of God as Father, I have no issue. When I think of submitting my life to God's, well, I'm still a guy, so I struggle with it a bit. But I don't struggle with it the way some people do, because I watched my dad for his life give himself to Jesus. I watched as the end came, the way that he tried to care for our family when he was giving up his own life. Just this morning, Brooklyn got real emotional, and so we took a walk out on the sidewalk, and she was crying, and I gave her a big hug, and I said, honey, feel what you need to feel. We got to feel it right now. Feel what you need to feel. But then remember, Pop wouldn't want you to sit in this, babe. Pop would want you to go have a good day, and he would want you to show people Jesus, because that's just what he did. Dads, I don't know that there's a more important thing that you can model and show your children than what it looks like to live humbly submitted to Christ every moment of every day in your life. So my hope is that today, maybe if you did not have a good father, maybe that today you could see God the Father as a good God, who in a moment when one of his children did a bad thing could have handed out justice, but instead handed out compassion and mercy, because that's who he is. And if you had a bad dad, and if you have a hard time imagining what it would look like for someone to care about you in that way, I'm evidence. And there are many around this room who I know have stories that are evidence of the goodness and the kindness and the compassion of God. That is who he is. That is what he does. It's not an accident that we sang that song this morning. He loves us. This is our God. Dads, if you struggle with humility, go to God with it. Humble yourself before him and tell him, I don't know how to be humble. Will you help me? But I got to warn you that if you do that, he will. You might not like it. Usually when God humbles us, he humbles us. And he brings us to our knees. But there's nothing more important that you can do for your kids than model that. If you're not a dad today, you're not off the hook either, because you're a part of a church family. And in a church family, it is critical that you model for other people what it looks like to live submitted to God. At the end of the day, what we see in the story of Cain and Abel is that God is a good and a kind and a compassionate father. And even in moments when we do terrible things as his kids, he will warn us. He will talk to us. He'll say, hey, this thing's coming. You need to make a different choice. And then we have a choice to make. Will I trust him when he does things or when he allows things that seem unfair? Or will I hold on to what I believe I deserve, thinking I know best? At the end of the day, the question is, will I humble myself and trust that the God who put the stars in the sky and the universe into motion, do I trust that he knows better than I do? Or do I think that I know what's best? As a guy, it's a hard choice, but it's the most important one. So today, make the decision, men, fathers, make the decision to humble yourself before the Lord. Allow him to work in your life, and allow your life to not be a testament to your strength and your ability, but allow your life to be a testament to his. Because at the end of the day, that will carry on far beyond you. Let me pray for us.